With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
Did you know they plan to build over 3,000 wind turbines on Queensland's Great Dividing Range? Over 3,700 kilometres of new haulage roads will carve through old growth forest. Destroying forests for industrial renewables makes no sense. It doesn't have to be this way. The intact biodiverse ranges of Queensland are no place for renewables. Take 2 minutes to learn the truth about the destruction they cause. Go to rainforestreserves.org.au.
For The World Today, this is James O'Neill. Russia has ordered the expulsion of a British diplomat, Gareth Samuel Davies, a secretary at the UK Embassy in Moscow, accusing him of working for British intelligence. The Federal Security Service said Davies was an undeclared agent, and the Foreign Ministry summoned the UK Chargé d'Affaires to demand his departure within 2 weeks. Russian officials stressed a zero-tolerance policy on national security threats. The British mission declined public comment. The move adds to long-standing tensions between Moscow and London, which has seen repeated tit-for-tat expulsions. Russia accuses the UK of playing a leading role in sustaining the Ukraine conflict, a claim Britain denies. U.S. President Donald Trump has singled out Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy as the main obstacle to a peace agreement with Russia in an Oval Office interview with Reuters. President Trump said Zelenskyy is having a hard time getting there, while Putin appears ready to negotiate. The relationship has been volatile since a contentious White House meeting last year, with Trump claiming Zelenskyy has no cards and calling him a dictator without elections. Russia signaled openness to further talks with Trump's envoys. A proposed peace framework remains stalled as Zelenskyy resists territorial concessions and elections without strong security guarantees, while his term expired in 2024 under martial law. French President Emmanuel Macron announced that France will deploy troops to Greenland to take part in joint military exercises with Denmark as European NATO allies rally behind Copenhagen amid U.S. pressure to gain control of the Arctic island. Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and now France have committed forces, though in relatively small numbers, to demonstrate Europe's ability to defend Greenland from perceived threats by Russia and China. The move follows meetings in Washington between U.S., Danish, and Greenlandic officials. President Trump reiterated that the United States needs Greenland for national security, warning that Russia or China could otherwise take control. Denmark and Greenland have rejected U.S. ownership, and talks continue. UK Defense Secretary John Healey said the deployment supports NATO and the Joint Expeditionary Forces Arctic Endurance Exercise and reflects shared concerns with President Trump over Arctic security. Danish officials acknowledged the recent talks in Washington failed to change the U.S. position on Greenland, but said further discussions would seek to address American concerns while respecting Denmark's sovereignty. Violent unrest erupted in Minneapolis after a second officer-involved shooting in a week, during which rioters attacked ICE vehicles and broke into weapons lockers, with video showing at least one rifle and ammunition taken. The unrest followed an incident in which a federal officer shot an alleged Venezuelan illegal immigrant who reportedly assaulted ICE agents with improvised weapons. Videos posted online show rioters ripping lockers from vehicles and attempting to steal their contents. Reports say Minneapolis police did not intervene, citing policies restricting assistance to immigration enforcement. Federal officials warned that assaults on federal officers have surged dramatically, raising concerns over public safety and coordination with local authorities. UK Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch removed senior rival Robert Jenrick from the shadow cabinet and expelled him from the Conservative Party, citing irrefutable evidence that he planned to defect to Nigel Farage's Reform UK. Jenrick, who held the immigration brief and was a prominent media figure, has not commented publicly. Farage acknowledged private talks with Jenrick, but said Badenoch may have acted in panic, joking he would buy Jenrick a drink. The move has been described as the opening of a deeper civil war on the British right. Badenoch said the decision was necessary to prevent further disruption, despite framing it as an effort to end political psychodrama.
Because the British public are tired of political psychodrama. So am I. They saw too much of it in the last government. They're seeing too much of it in this government. I will not repeat those mistakes.
This has been James O'Neill for The World Today.
Father wears his Sunday best. Mother's tired, she needs a rest. The kids are playing up downstairs. Sister's sighing in her sleep. Brother's got a date to keep, he can't hang around.
And then for the defense.
Our house it has a crowd. There's always something happening, and it's usually quite loud.
How long do you think we're gonna stay here for?
Our house, in the middle of our street. Our house, in the middle of our...
There is a problem with medicine, and we can explain what it is by looking back to the discovery of penicillin. Penicillin, it turns out, was not just an accidental finding. Alexander Fleming discovered that mold he found in a culture dish was killing bacteria, but it took over 10 years before a team at Oxford University were able to isolate the active ingredient. They produced small quantities for preclinical and clinical trials, helping prove the compound was safe and could beat infection. However, they couldn't produce it at scale. In 1941, Andrew Jackson Moyer of the US Department of Agriculture, the forerunner to the FDA, suggested changes to the manufacturing process, enabling mass production. It turns out medicines are not invented when someone discovers a new molecular entity. They are the product of key stakeholders working together collaboratively. Until medicine can be manufactured at scale, it may as well not exist. And in 2025, this is a problem. In the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies began outsourcing production. Suddenly the system was significantly less integrated. Someone with a new discovery today will find themselves disconnected from the rest of the development and manufacturing process. Companies that develop medicine are still happy to work with big established pharma companies, but the modern day Flemings are cut out of the system. The result is far fewer new medicines coming to market. We want to fix this by ensuring the pharma industry builds a more integrated supply chain. We also believe that doctors' expertise administering medicine should be included at the beginning of the process. We know that doctors on the front line have insights about how to repurpose medicine. Doctors should be able to report their findings so that the necessary testing can be completed and they can share the results worldwide. Learn more here and help us take medicines back to the future.
With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
To the world today and the Protagonists. It's a Friday. Nice to have your company. We're just waiting on one extra panel member to pop up. He's in Moscow at the moment, Johnny Miller. Hopefully he'll join us very shortly. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has been pushed aside in the mainstream media. Trump is distracted with Iran and Greenland and other places, and his envoys are incapable of paving the way to a peace plan. Perhaps we should be concerned about President Putin's mindset. Has Putin lost interest in a peace deal, given the arrogant and unrealistic obstinance of the Europeans? Russia struck back aggressively following the attack on his residence, which the Americans most definitely had a hand in. Russia successfully fired multiple nuclear-capable 8,000 miles per hour hypersonic Oreshnik missiles and drones at Kyiv and Lviv in western Ukraine. Russian attacks since October 2025 have hit 256 energy sites, including plants and substations, leaving millions at risk during the coldest winter in decades. Now, President Zelenskyy has declared a state of emergency in the energy sector, perhaps a few more windmills, so they can take pot shots and knock them over again. These attacks on Ukraine's energy sector will seriously impact European gas supplies. Tucker Carlson reports Russia is actively considering nuke strikes against the UK and Germany. What impact will this have on Trump and the Europeans? Our panel today, as I said, we're still waiting on Johnny Miller, but our panel at the moment is Dr. John Laughland, Forum of Democracy International, and Mats Nilsson, a geopolitical analyst. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. First of all, John, can you just give me your impressions of where we're at the moment?
Well, it's a good moment to take stock because it's about a year, isn't it, since Trump took office. And as soon as he did a year ago, he started to talk about peace, which, of course, the Europeans had not been talking about. They've been talking about supporting Ukraine in its war effort. And in their absolutely extreme servility, they immediately adopted the Trumpian vocabulary of peace and claimed to want peace themselves. And they also started talking about peace. So the whole debate really for a year now has been about, so supposedly, at least on the face of it, about peace. In reality, this vocabulary is nothing but an illustration of something which Clausewitz said 200 years ago. He said, in a war, everybody wants peace. Even the aggressor wants peace. Even the person who starts a war wants peace. You obviously have peace before the aggression, but the aggressor wants a different peace. He wants war, yes, but in view of obtaining peace at the end. And that's more or less the situation now. The Europeans, I think Trump does want a capitulation of Ukraine. It seems that he does. Certainly that's what he has said. He's implied that Ukraine ought to give up territory, for example. Of course, we never know exactly. Trump is very difficult to read, but if we take what he says at face value, we might conclude that he does indeed want Ukraine to be defeated, essentially, and peace to come about through a Russian victory. The Europeans, however, have the completely opposite goal. They met in Paris, here in Paris, where I'm speaking to you from, on the 6th of January, and they agreed to send British and French troops into Ukraine once a hypothetical ceasefire was reached. That deal of the 6th of January is proof that they do not want peace. Why? Because if a ceasefire were to open the door, as they say it should, to the presence of Western troops in Ukraine, then Russia will not agree to a ceasefire. In other words, the formula that they agreed at Paris is precisely designed to sabotage what, as I say, appear on the face of it to be genuine peace efforts by Trump. And that situation hasn't changed. They still are using this language of peace, but in reality, as I say, setting up undertakings, particularly the sending of troops, obviously the continuing arming of Ukraine and so on, with the goal, in my view, of sabotaging any peace effort. Sabotaging it, why? Because they want Ukraine, they want the Ukraine war for a variety of reasons. Ideological, of course, they want to defeat Russia, but also for internal EU political reasons. They want to consolidate the internal cohesion of the EU, which of course is extremely damaged and has been now for a while. And above all, they want to pursue a sort of war economy. They want to do a sort of Keynesian reanimation of their economy through massive loans, which they hope will go at least in part to their own defense industries. So right now, there's no end in sight because, as I say, the Europeans seem determined to continue this war in spite of what appear to be, I repeat, genuine efforts to ensure a Ukrainian capitulation by the Americans.
Mats Nilsson, analyst extraordinaire, what's your thoughts?
There are a lot of thoughts in my head right now, but one in regards to this elusive piece is that there is really no basis for any talks, considering the facts that the stakes are at this point in time seen as existential on both sides. So even though there is, I mean, everyone knows that negotiations and a ceasefire would save lives, the war on both sides is now framed as a fight for national survival. It's a fight for identity of nationhood. So compromise becomes, even peace talks is somehow equated with surrender or possible annihilation in a later step. So for Ukraine, compromising on territorial sovereignty is seen as validating the Russian aggression, and then you come back to those arguments that always appear in wars that get prolonged. You will be betraying those who died, and you will be inviting future Russian attacks. So the core principle is you cannot compromise on your right to exist as a sovereign nation. Now, Russia has the same arguments. From a Kremlin perspective, compromise would mean that you once again would have to trust the deceitful West. And in Russia's perspective, the West has time and time again gone back on the promises given. Of course, the most obvious case in point is the Minsk agreements, where it was even declared by, for example, Merkel, that Minsk was implemented to give Ukraine time to arm. So Russia sees it as if they would agree to a ceasefire, if they would agree to these European military troops placed in Ukraine, it would just be a lull in the existential fight to keep Russia safe from the NATO forces. And once you reach this level where trust is the lack of trust is, I would claim, to be almost absolute, because compromise and negotiations on a psychological level requires a basic level of trust that each other side will honor an agreement. In this war, at this point, trust is zero, and at points probably even on a negative scale. So therefore we're not going to see any peace deal unless there is a major military shift, and by that I mean suddenly the Ukrainian lines start to crumble due to a morale problem and lack of manpower. Then we might have it, but it's not going to come by diplomacy, because there is absolutely no trust.
Who's the John? I just got to ask you, who do you think is the worst person or worst entity to deal with? Is it Trump, because his track record is appalling, or is it just simply Europe, because their track record, Europe baying for an all-out war? And I can't understand the enthusiasm for the annihilation of mankind, and that's what it would be. Putin himself has said, or they're reporting that the UK and Germany would be the first targets. So, which is worse? And Donald Trump, I don't think he understands. He's not dealing with property. He's not buying a big building and he's going to get as much money as possible for it, or get it for as least amount of money. He's dealing with various governments, and various governments have their own agenda. They haven't got any interest in a guy saying that we're the biggest, most magnificent country in the world. We're going to take over anything we want to, and you'll do as we tell you. So on that hand, you have Donald Trump, who's just truly becoming. He's a very scary person, but equally scary are the Europeans. Tell me, why are they pushing so much for a war with Russia?
Well, I alluded to that in the last part of my first answer. I think, to answer your first question, your main question, I think that the Europeans are on balance worse. Trump, of course, yes, is highly unpredictable. I think that's his shtick, actually. I think he his unpredictability is part of his is a sort of strategy, if you like. You never know what he's going to do next. He says the most outrageous things. He does outrageous things. Everyone is left completely stunned by his various declarations, and then he walks out of the room and leaves everyone, as I say, completely stunned, and then asks for 150% and then gets 100% of what he wants. So there are certainly many, and as you say, he does approach these things as a property developer, at least in some cases. But actually, that aspect of it gives me a little glimmer of hope. I mean, I'm aware of people, and I listen to them with great respect and interest. I'm thinking of a fellow called Brian Beletic, who's quite active online, who argues that there is no distance between Trump and the Europeans, and the whole thing is simply for show, and that the Europeans are simply the war against Russia is simply being outsourced by the Americans, so that the Americans can direct their attention elsewhere. And I think there's a lot in that, but as you said, Mike, in your question, there is the property the property magnate element. I mean, he does send Jared Kushner into these Russian negotiations, just as he sent him to Israel as well. Kushner, of course, is not a White House official. He's Trump's son-in-law and himself a president. So that suggests that there may be some economic calculation on Trump's side, and therefore possibly, although I very much agree with what Matt Nilsson just said, possibly some tiny window of opportunity for some kind of agreement. The reason why the Europeans wanted, I said that in my first answer, they think of it as a way to consolidate the power of the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen, when she took office in 2019, said that she wanted hers to be a geopolitical commission. This was long before the current Ukraine war broke out, 3 or 4 years before. And she sees this war as a way of reinforcing the central powers of Brussels, and above all, of course, as a way of creating some kind of European defense capacity. The $90 billion loan and the other loans which are going to be raised for Ukraine, they hope that some of that money will go into European defense manufacturing, particularly, of course, in Germany, where she's from. So I think those are the two reasons. And then there's an ideological aspect. And in some ways, I think the ideological aspect is almost the most important. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I teach philosophy, and so I think ideas are important. But I mean, I've followed and been partly involved in this whole East-West matter now for 15 years. And long before the invasion of 2022 and long before the events of 2014, going back really actually to 2000 when Putin took office, the West has, I think this is really what Mats was referring to. Mats, you talked about existential threats, and I think you were referring mainly to Ukraine and Russia. But I think there's an existential element for the Europeans as well. And that is that Europe defines itself as the anti-Russia, or rather it sees Russia as the anti-Europe. Russia embodies for these European ideologues everything which they do not want Europe to be, which they think Europe no longer is. They think of Russia as conservative, rooted in history, Christian, reactionary, and so on. It's it's a very old meme, as we would say today, of Russophobia going back many centuries. And Europe, by contrast, is post-historical, post-Christian, woke. Everything. Embodies all these modern values, which Russia, in their view, does not embody. And this is existential for them, because if there are other countries, particularly if they're big ones and right next door, which don't embody these supposedly universal postmodern values, then those postmodern values clearly are not universal. Because if you have another country next door that rejects them, then they're not universal. And so there is an existential element, if you like, on the European side as well.
I just want to ask you, Matt, because I think I'm going to try and get his name right here. Putin advisor Sergei Karaganov. He portrays the European conflict not as a local war, but as Russia's fight against a morally degenerate Europe. And he goes on to say that he actually thinks that if this keeps going, between 1 and 2 years, there will be a nuclear war. That itself is very scary, because up until just recently, even though it was the Europeans who were pushing, and along with the UK pushing maybe for a stoush with Russia, and even though we knew that Russia had these an arsenal of deadly weapons, there was really, you thought there could have been a war, but maybe not. Now that we have his advisor, Putin's advisor, suggesting that within 1 to 2 years, if this continues, there will be some conflict with nukes. That itself is very scary, isn't
it? Most definitely, and I'm of a generation who remember sitting down in the British school I was attending at the time, and the teacher putting on the movie The Day After, which was a movie made in regards to a nuclear apocalypse back in the 1980s. And I think both Reagan and Gorbachev at the time commented on that movie, saying, or at least Reagan saying it was a wake-up call for him. I don't see any wake-up calls today, so that's always a possibility, because all wars suddenly glide into their own logic, and thereby things get out of hand quite quickly. In the First World War, everyone would be home by Christmas, and it dragged on in the trenches for years after that. And in regards to what Dr. Laughland said, I would actually like to say, you can go back to the year 2000. You can also go back 170 years, and you could go back to the Crimean War.
Yeah.
Because there, if you recall, you had a situation where mainly France and England were helping the Ottoman Empire to stave off Russia, which was framed in the propaganda as a very noble cause to help the Ottoman Empire and to keep the Russians at bay.
Yeah.
But of course, this was just a proxy war for the time. They were not there to help the Ottoman Empire. I mean, it was openly declared that they were there to stop Russia. And Russia at the time, like now, felt that they were misunderstood, because I think the Nicholas the First was the Tsar back then, or second. Pardon me if I got the numbers wrong. But there was a letter that he wrote to one of his fellow members at court, complaining that, why am I being blamed for trying to get the land of Romania and Wallachia? Why am I being blamed for trying to protect the Orthodox people in the Ottoman Empire, while France is grabbing Algiers, and while Great Britain is every year grabbing a new small state in India? Why shouldn't I be allowed to enter Wallachia and the modern-day Romania to help protect? Why am I being perceived as the bad guy? Now, I mean, if we look at today, it's basically a carbon copy of this situation. And once again, I think that the West has never really left that vision of destroying Russia for basically just geopolitical reasons. And that also makes it difficult in the situation to sit down and have these talks, because no one wants to realize what the driving force behind this conflict is. It's not about anything else than geopolitical power struggles, as it once has been. So you would need a new concert of nations to be created in order to manage these re-emerging conflicts. And I think that the idea and the ability to do diplomacy on this level has been lost to the current generations of politicians. So this is also one of this problems facing any peace talks, that diplomats are not ready for the complexity that these talks would involve, because it's not just about Ukraine and Russia. You would need to involve also all the countries around the Black Sea. You would need to include the European security structure, which is, as Dr. Laughland said, crumbling in itself. You would perhaps also need to include China and India. It's such a large undertaking that I think that diplomats are daunted by the task, because they're not really used to having to sit down for weeks and months going through the niceties of any agreement. So unfortunately, peace is a long time coming.
Yeah, I got to. It's on that interview with Tucker Carlson, with Tucker Carlson and Sergei Karaganov. He was saying that this is just some of his thoughts. The target's Britain and Germany. Germany first, because he says it's the source of the worst in European history, and the rationale, a necessary sin to save humanity from a wider war Europe is already provoking. Where to now, John? What do we do? Because we have this, it's no longer bluster, and Putin's not renowned for blustering, but we have, it's becoming very, very serious. And if you and Matt's mentioned the day after, which is the day after 2 is coming out next year, if we have a planet. And I've been looking at videos about nuclear attacks and whatever, because if Russia attacks Germany or not attacks, but if they decide to launch a couple of missiles because they have been attacked, so they're retaliating, you would have once you drop a bomb onto Germany and then onto Britain, you're going to have a world war before you know it. And some of the videos that I've seen, John, are absolutely terrifying. Within an hour, there's someone saying there's billions already killed and the planet itself is dead. And I have to say, I do not understand, for all the money, as we would say in China, why this is continuing, except that we have, as Sergei mentions, that it's the European hostility and is so evil.
I haven't seen the Karaganov interview. I think that I've seen a clip, but I haven't watched the whole of it. I think Tucker slightly oversold his interview. I don't believe that Karaganov is an advisor in any structural sense. He doesn't have any role in the Russian government. He's a kind of policy wonk. I've met him. He's been on, policy wonk conferences now for decades. He runs, if I'm not mistaken, a sort of geopolitical institute in Moscow. So I think Tucker has slightly oversold him. The reason why his views are interesting, however, is that he does express, and indeed has been expressing for months. There's nothing new in this allusion to the possibility of a strike on a Western European target. Karaganov has been saying this for quite a long time, as indeed have Russian officials, unlike Karaganov, who is not a Russian official, government officials, I mean. They've been talking about this. What Karaganov embodies is an increasing, I would say, impatience. It's a shame Johnny Miller isn't with us, because he lives in Moscow. He could speak more authoritatively than I can from here in Paris. An increasing impatience by commentators, by policy wonks, by talking heads in Russia at the extremely slow pace of the war, and at the fact that the Europeans, as you've said, Mike, continue to stick spokes in the wheels of the supposed peace process. This impatience is very, very present on the talk shows in Russia. People talk about nuking London and so on. They've been doing that for years. Karaganov is a serious figure, and his argument, as I understand it, is that we the Russians will sooner or later need to do that in order to teach these idiots a lesson. Because you and Mats have both, you, Mike, and Mats, you've both talked about the horrors of nuclear war, but from my perspective, nobody in the European Union seems to have any understanding of that. They seem to be behaving as if that were not a possibility, whereas of course it is. And that's what frightens me, I think, more than anything, that they are indeed continuing to poke the Russian bear. And as I say, impatience is rising in Russia. When the Americans seized Maduro, my God, you can only imagine how furious, or rather envious, Russian commentators were. They thought, well, why the hell didn't we do that with Zelenskyy at the beginning? And the whole thing could have been over in a few weeks. So that's what Karaganov embodies. He embodies the public sentiment, I would say, in Russia, which I suspect is increasingly impatient with the slow pace of the war. I'd like to say something in respect to Mats Nilsson's very interesting remarks about the Crimean War, which are, of course, quite correct. Mats, you talked about the concert of nations and how that would be necessary, and I very much agree with that. However, when we go back indeed to the 19th century, we I'm afraid can only shake our heads in sadness that the concert of nations is a very, very long way in the past. Precisely what happened after the Crimean War, when the concert of Europe more or less still functioned in the middle of the 19th century, was that Europe moved towards a system of blocks, with Britain, France, and Russia on one side, and the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary and Germany, on the other. And those blocks, of course, led to the First World War and to the collapse of Europe as a geopolitical center. The blocks being the opposite of the concert of Europe. The concert of Europe, the concert of nations, was a much more flexible arrangement where the great powers could interact with one another in varying constellations and ultimately were able to sort out and avoid major crises. The bloc mentality, which took shape right at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the Triple Alliance was formed in 1907, that mentality, we've never left it. And in this century, more than a century now, since the bloc mentality took over, which of course has been consolidated for the last 75 years by NATO, and I would say even more so in the last 4 years of the Russia-Ukraine war. The bloc mentality, oddly enough, Russia, historically, not just the Soviet Union, but Imperial Russia in the 19th century, has on many, many occasions tried to get out of it, although, of course, they were part of it with the British and the French from 1907, from 1896 for France and then 1907 for England. It's a long, long tradition in Russian foreign policy, going back, as I say, to before the Soviet times, to try to create collective security in Europe. Nicholas II tried it in 1899. One of the previous emperors tried it in 1868 with the St. Petersburg Declaration. The Soviets tried it, particularly in the 1930s. That was the whole drama of Munich and the 1939, the period after Munich, when the Russians once again under Stalin, tried to get a collective security arrangement. Then after the war in the 1950s, then if we fast forward, Gorbachev with the Common European Home, then under Medvedev when he was president. And indeed, even now, when I was in Russia in November 2024, people said to me, well, what we really want is a collective European security system. I was absolutely amazed that they were still talking about it in the present circumstances, because I think it's completely impossible. But this is a long, long Russian tradition. And of course, that's what they asked for, the Russians, at the end of 2021 before they invaded Ukraine. They wrote to the Americans and NATO and said, we want a collective security arrangements. But I repeat, we are unfortunately so far away from that on both sides. You're right, Mats, the Russians have zero trust in us. And in the Americans, I imagine. And the Europeans certainly have zero trust in them.
Mats, Sweden, in one of your tweets just a month ago or thereabouts, you mentioned that they were about to take delivery of some missiles from, I think, from the US, and that you were suggesting that they would point those at Russia to fire upon Russia. It would seem that at the moment, Sweden, along with Denmark, Germany, France, and Norway, aren't very happy with the US because you're not going to take Greenland away. I'm just wondering, have these countries been drinking a particular substance or something? I'm not too sure, because I don't understand. I mean, Sweden it's not, not known for an aggressor of this sort, but at the moment it wants to involve itself into two wars, one with the US and one with Russia. Now, what possibly could go wrong? What's your thoughts on this?
I have a lot of thoughts on that as well.
Good.
But the situation we see in Sweden today is one of that old duality between the official state and, of course, that hidden state, the deep state in Sweden, which has been quite strong all the way through. I mean, Sweden was for all intents and purposes not a neutral country during the Cold War. It was very much intertwined with the NATO alliance on the deep state level. And this is the same situation today. Of course, the politicians are huffing and puffing about, Trump, bad Trump, Trump is bigly evil and going after Greenland. But we just had a huge security conference, the yearly Swedish security conference up in the Swedish mountains, where our commander-in-chief said, Trump is doing this, Trump is doing that. But we, the military, our cooperation, no problems whatsoever. It's smooth sailing all the way. And by this I mean there are other forces at play here for Sweden in regards to the United States. There is, of course, some political issues being raised by parties on the far left and the far right, saying that the agreement with the United States on them being able to place military forces on Swedish territory, the so-called DCA agreement, should be revoked. But there is and it's not going to happen, obviously, and there's absolutely no discussion, pardon me, about leaving NATO. So those missiles are not actually placed here to be launched from Sweden. They're placed here. Sweden is in the bigger issues of things. Sweden is the run-up area. Sweden will be the area where all the weapons are kept to be then later transferred to the Baltics and Finland in case a war would be erupted or would erupt. So those missiles are just going to be juicy targets in a hopefully future that won't come. But there is absolutely no discussion in Sweden either about making Sweden a target. So Sweden's place right now in this wonderful patchwork of international systems with a paralyzed UN security, you have different small functional cooperations within the EU, and as we can see, even NATO is being fragmentized between the western NATO countries who don't really see any problems in certain areas, and of course the countries in the Arctic and the Baltics who are very afraid every day about what's going to happen. So Sweden lacks rudder and lacks moral stamina as we once had on the official political level. The Swedish deep state, of course, is just the same as it's been since 1946, but that's a different discussion for a different show.
John, I'm just because we're just going to get off Russia, Ukraine just for a moment, because there are other exciting things happening. If Trump does decide that I want Greenland, that's what I want. Greenland, here I come. What does Europe do?
Well, it's an absolutely incredible situation, isn't it? As you know, troops have been sent. You mentioned it. Your news reporter mentioned it. French, Swedish, British, I think. Troops have been sent to Finland. Danish, obviously. On one level, NATO would presumably collapse if there were to be a conflict. I listen once again with great interest to Mats and to the people who talk about the deep state, and I think that is, in a way, the answer. So on the political level, it's Were there to be a grab, were there to be a conflict, which of course Trump has threatened, then it's very difficult to see how the NATO alliance could continue. But what Mats Nilsson has just said about the deep state is absolutely key. And of course, we can see this in operation already. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, immediately said, yes, the security of the Arctic is very important. NATO has to protect it. In other words, they immediately adopted, as they did with the language of peace that I referred to in my first answer to you, Mike, they immediately adopted Trump's language in order to try to steer him in the direction that they want. And when we contemplate the possibility of some kind of unilateral action by America against Greenland, and when we contemplate the possibility of some kind of major conflict, whether military or a very severe political conflict, we must never lose sight of the fact that Mats Nilsson has just referred to, which is that since we've all been, most of the European states have been members of NATO now for 75 years, either de jure or de facto, because as Matt says, countries like Sweden and so on have clearly been deeply penetrated. The same is true, by the way, of Switzerland as well, another neutral country. If there were to be a conflict, political or military, it's terrifying to think what would happen internally in European states. What I mean by that is we have, I am sure, at every level of all our militaries, of all the European militaries and of all the European intelligence services, we have people who are essentially NATO/American agents. They work for America, they work for NATO. Their loyalties would be to the American side of the equation. I can only speculate at the internal drama which would play out within the European security structures, because I repeat, a very large number of people inside those structures, inside what Matt calls the deep state, would, I am sure, for professional, ideological, and other reasons, support the American side, and therefore they would try, as I say, in the hypothetical scenario of a unilateral American action, they would try somehow to come to some kind of agreement. And once again, that's what Rutte ultimately has immediately proposed, that somehow we together would smooth over this unilateral act.
Yeah, but if they say, we want Greenland and Europe says
well,
no.
they have said we want Greenland, and for the time being, Denmark is saying no way, and so on. But other countries are not. Mark Rutte is not saying that. Mark Rutte has not said no way. I'm not saying Mark Rutte is the one who decides. I'm giving him as an example of this deep state, of this Atlanticist establishment. I don't know what other words to use, who would essentially side with the Americans. Rutte, after all, when this issue was first raised, or not first, but anyway, it was raised in front of him in the Oval Office, going back, I think, nearly a year. He just sat there and grinned while Trump said, "I'm going to take over the territory of a NATO ally." So I think lots of people within European structures would do the same, and therefore the extent of our colonization, of Europe's colonization by America, is just breathtaking to behold and terrifying to behold, as I say, because once again, if we were to imagine a severe conflict, then I have very little faith in the European structures opposing any kind of real opposition to it.
Mats, do you think, because John is right, and I couldn't imagine could you imagine Europe decides to take on Russia and the US? Then you got to have it would be chaotic. But I'm just wondering. I'll throw this one to Mats. Is this just a thing that Donald is just throwing out there to create the chaos or the thought of chaos within Europe?
Well, it could be one of Donald's deal-making
Big, beautiful.
scenarios. The beautiful ones, the bigly beautiful deal-making scenarios. And the possible end game on this deal could be that he gets Greenland fortified. And by that I mean there would be once again a need for military investments in reopening the American bases. Because you have to remember, America has closed a multitude of bases on Greenland. They just have one base left now, the old Thule base. That's the one which is there, and then they have a few that are not manned. They're just autonomous bases. Probably he wants Europe to start paying for rearming Greenland, and he's doing this by playing really, really tough. Now, the thing you have to remember, which is on the positive side for Europe, is that the Danes, they have a reputation for being really, really good negotiators. I negotiated myself with Danes from time to time, and I mean, you have to check that you still have the pencil which you signed the agreement with when you leave the room, because they're highly skilled negotiators. I mean, they are people and a nation of tradesmen. They've always been, and they still are. So, I mean, there's going to be tough negotiations, but there is a possibility that Trump is doing this once again to foster certain military industrial investments. And instead of America taking on the responsibility, he kind of forces or makes the Europeans believe that that we have to make the investments to protect Greenland for whatever reason. So I don't think there is going to be a shift of sovereignty, but there's going to be European taxpayer money wasted on arming Greenland again without any need to it. But out of fear of Trump doing something bigly badly, Europe is going to oblige America by investing our taxpayer money in Greenland defense against a non-existent enemy.
John, again, the thought of a stoush with the US and Europe, and if it is a way of generating a consensus on something that he's trying to push. But if you look at Trump with Venezuela, going to attack the country that makes magnificent tequila, Cuba is not out of the firing line. Then you have Iran. A lot of this, if you wanted, because you don't have to attack a country or a number of countries to spread the fear of God, which is in Donald's case himself. And so therefore his negotiating power on the international scene or stage becomes has a lot more impact. And again, I think if you look at him, it's the schoolyard bully on one hand is just now, that if you make me angry, I'll get green and get really, really big, and that's what he's become. And I'm just wondering whether this is just part of his negotiating stance or armory on getting what he wants. Because if you don't do what we want, we're going to just pop in and use our brand new weapons that makes your nose bleed and kills you, and we're going to nick anyone we want to nick. So I'm just thinking, is it just a lot of this bluster from Donald Trump's point of view? Dangerous bluster, because it adds to the already the high energy of or the high stress levels because of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. But do you think maybe it's just Donald being Donald and being that negotiator or that person that wants to get what he wants?
Yeah, but the two are not exclusive. I think the bluster, yes, it is a part of the strategy. America has had a gangsterish approach to foreign policy for a long time. Trump is just bringing that now even more out into the open than it already was. As you say, the foreign policy is like the mafia. You arrive in a new part of town, you smash all the windows, and then you say to people, we know where your children go to school. That is indeed an accurate way of characterizing American foreign policy. But I think that, once again, what Mats Nilsson has just said is absolutely right. The goal is the rush for the Arctic, if you like. It is to militarize the Arctic. However he achieves it, that is the goal. That's the strategy. We'll know why, by the way. Obviously, Russia is an immense power. It has a gigantic Arctic coast. The Arctic is being used increasingly for transport. The various icebreaker ships and so on work better and better, it seems. The outcome is already, I repeat, the outcome is the outcome of getting the Europeans to essentially pay or at least participate in this militarization of the Arctic is already underway. I've mentioned Mark Rutte, but Emmanuel Macron also said that yes, Europe has to take care, NATO and so on have to take care of Arctic security. So that is the outcome. But yes, of course, the bluster is part of his particular style, but it works. And whatever we may think of the Venezuela operation, or indeed of the attack on Iran back in July, I think it was last year, these are spectacular operations. The Venezuela operation was spectacular. I'm not saying I approve of it, but it was objectively an extraordinary thing to do, and it worked. So, as you said, Mike, in your question, his negotiating power is very, very considerable, and he is, we all know what his goal is. It's to make America great again, and yeah, for the time being, he seems to be succeeding.
Matt's for Europe to go to war, they've got to have money. And they're very enthusiastic spending money. For example, 45 billion on Ukraine, the LGBTQ agenda, 2.8 billion, migrants, 5 billion, NGOs, another one of 2.5 billion. So they haven't got a whole lot of money to play with. Where does this, if the stoush continues with Russia, and that Europe decide to put their hand up and join it, and if there's I wouldn't say a war with the US, but if they have to be on their full mettle, where are they going to get the money? I mean, they're almost bankrupt as it is in many cases, and do they have to? And again, is Trump pushing them to change their mindset?
Europe is, I mean, we don't have any energy, we don't have any real strong basis of natural resources. Our industry has been dilapidated over the past decades. Mm-hmm. Europe is in a bind. It's in an economic mess, and trying to solve this mess by military Keynesianism obviously isn't going to work, because we're basically placing ourselves in a old Soviet situation, where you try to create money out of nothing in order to bolster a faltering military by military investments, and also we would be placing ourselves in an American situation where you would have to take continuous loans in order to feed those military expenditures that America has been doing, and they have been able to do so due to the fact that the dollar has been working as the fiat currency of choice and pegged to the dollar. But what Trump is doing in Venezuela, it's basically gaining energy resources in order to keep the dollar afloat. By saying, look, you can still trust the dollar because we have energy. I mean, it all goes back to the energy that you can provide. And right now, Europe doesn't have that. So Europe is ill-fitted to do anything rash when it comes to the area of war. And I mean, just looking at the situation, there are basically, we don't have any stocks left because all the weapon stocks have been depleted in Ukraine, and we're struggling to try and get them up to speed again, because we don't have the materials and the resources to rebuild what has been destroyed by Russia on the steppes of Ukraine. And a lot of those military products also, if you trace them back, they are produced and exported from China. So, I mean, I think one power that's right now enjoying the situation somewhat is China, because they know everyone is paying them to provide them with the components for the weapons that are being used. So it's just no one is thinking in Europe right now, and Europe is, yes, Mike, in a very precarious situation.
John, in summary, just your thoughts on what do you think will happen? I mean, let's not go ahead for 1 or 2 years down the track. Let's just look at the next month, for example. What do you see happening between Russia, I mean, it's Russia and NATO at this stage, but Russia, Ukraine, NATO, Europe, anybody want to throw into that mix? What do you see happening? Do you think there will be, I mean, if you talk about a peace deal, if I was Putin, I'd be very wary of where they suggest he should meet them. You look at the past performance, they wanted to blow him up, and he decided that this is not for me at that stage. So where do you see this thing moving towards over the next 4 or 5, maybe 2 months?
It's extremely difficult to say. I don't think there will be a peace agreement in that period. I don't think there'll be a peace agreement in the near future, or even in the medium term. I suppose what I'm wondering about above all, but I've been wondering about it for at least a year, is whether there will be any substantial Russian advance in Ukraine, for example, into the port town of Odessa, and thereby to cut Ukraine off from its coastline, to cut it off completely from the Black Sea. That move, if it were possible and if it happened, would, I think, be a decisive moment, because then, of course, Ukraine, as I say, would be cut off from the sea. And that, one assumes, if that were to happen, that would presumably trigger some kind of regime change in Ukraine itself. But, I've been wondering about this, as have many other people, for a very long time. I thought it would happen already last year, but it hasn't. So I suppose what I think is that there will just be the current stasis, the current stalemate, the current grinding on and on and on, the war of attrition. Europe thinks, the Europeans think, that's why, by the way, they're determined to sabotage Trump's plans, if those are indeed really his plans, because their strategy, this was laid out by the Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski only last week, is to prolong the war for another 2 years. That's the 90 billion. That's the famous 90 billion. That's supposed to last for 2 years. Why 2 years? Because they are convinced that Russia is going to collapse in that period. But of course, it's the other way around. As Mats Nilsson has just said, Europe is disindustrialized and heavily indebted and doesn't have any natural resources. The debt situation in Europe is indeed absolutely dire. I'm speaking to you from Paris, and the French state is literally out of control. It's literally ungovernable. France has not had a government, a functioning government now, since 2024, since the summer of 2024. This has been dragging on now for well over a year. Macron dissolved the French National Assembly back in June of 2024, and there has not been a functioning government since then. There have been governments, there is a government, but it can't control the state, and in particular, it can't control state spending. France currently does not have a budget for the current year. It's been unable to vote through a budget. This is very, very serious stuff, particularly since its spending is out of control. The debt levels are way out of control. They're double what they should be according to the famous rules. And so the situation is indeed extremely precarious. The level of indebtedness, not just in the European Union, by the way, in Britain as well, is absolutely horrific. The costs of the interest on this gigantic debt is colossal. 60 billion a year for France, 110 billion a year for Britain, and so on. So it's we in the West who are in a state of extreme fragility. And yet here we are waging a war of attrition, thinking that the other side is about to collapse, believing in the myth of sanctions. The European Union is, I believe, even now preparing its, 20th package of sanctions. They still clearly believe in that, otherwise they wouldn't carry on doing it. I think, again, Mats, you mentioned Soviet style. I think you're referring to the material aspect, but we are indeed in a Soviet situation, we in Western Europe, in the also in the ideological sense. The Soviets, after all, destroyed their own country through ideology because they were attached to their communist ideology, which of course drove them into a wall. And we in Europe are in that situation. The ideology is so powerful, it has gripped people's minds so powerfully, as have no doubt other factors, including, as I said a moment ago, penetration by the Atlanticist structures. But the ideology has gripped minds so powerfully that it will continue to drive Europe into the wall until some crunch point comes. But when that crunch point will come, I don't know. I mean, the whole house of cards of the Western financial system should have collapsed a long time ago, and yet somehow it seems to stagger on. But I don't think that'll be for very long.
Mats, what do you think? What's your thoughts on that, to add what John has just said?
There's one thing that I return to when it comes to this, and concerning also the financial system collapsing and a larger war emerging. It's the fact that the end goal with, or the end situation where you would have a third world war involving nuclear weapons, and where you would have a collapse of the financial institutions, that is not good for business. And by that I mean the corporations that are right now reaping huge financial rewards due to the volatile situation, they need to keep this on a level of it not escalating into a full-blown third world war or a total collapse of the financial system. Because once the middle classes go, either due to a third world war or to a total financial collapse, the corporations also lose. So therefore, I'm always hopeful in one sense that the greed of certain actors within the deep state or within the financial institutions is going to keep them from pushing this too far. But one never knows. Like we said before, these things get their own mindset and its own logic, and it just spins out of control. So today, I mean, we're living in times where really you can get up in the morning not knowing if the world is still out there, because things happen fast, and I think no one is anymore in any absolute control, at least not in Europe. And in a situation like this, there is definitely not going to be a ceasefire agreement in Russia.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely brilliant conversation. We've gone way over, and I apologise for that because, Mats, I know you have to get your children to school, unless they're already there. I'm not too sure about that part, but
they're gone.
I think I can see that sigh of relief. Quiet for the day. John, if somebody wants to find out more about you and maybe communicate with you and follow your writings and stuff like that, how do they do that?
Well, that's very kind. You mentioned that I'm the director of Forum for Democracy International. I'm also a university lecturer. The website for Forum for Democracy International is fvdinternational.com. I have a Twitter feed, which is John_Laughland. So those are the ways that people can contact me.
And Mats, what about you?
Basically, I've been working out of X for the last decade or so. So it's just at Masse Nilsson, and that's an MAZZENILSSON. And from there you can see all the other or the newspapers or periodicals I work with. So that's a good start if you care to keep.
Great conversation. We got a message from Johnny Miller. He tried a bunch of times, just couldn't do it, and so maybe he's not allowed to talk to us.
I think there's been a cyber attack in Russia. Actually, I think
it's difficult. If you're in Moscow, it can be difficult at times. I tried contacting him multiple times, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, when I was there, I could not do much at all. I had all these great plans. I'll do this broadcast and that. Couldn't do it. A great conversation, though. I wish you all the very best for the weekend. Enjoy the weekend. I'm going to go home for a Pinot Noir, and a barbecue because it's warm here. I suggest, Matt and John, that you don't do it because you'll get hypothermia. But then a good whiskey will fix it up. Thank you very much for your time. This is The Protagonists, and this is The World Today. Have a great weekend. See you Monday.